G'day everyone, and thanks very much, David. Can I also thank Luke Sheehy, the new Chief Executive Officer of Universities Australia, and give Luke a clap as well. Congratulations, mate, on the new gig. Off to a flying start, and I'm really looking forward to working with you. I also want to thank the great Katrina Jackson. This is a big job. It's a big job and it's a hard one, and you did it with distinction. We're all going to miss you, and I really hope to see you in another role in higher education in the not too distant future. Also want to recognise, of course, Professor David Lloyd, a good man and a great leader. The unflappable Secretary of the Department of Education, Mr. Tony Cook. The extraordinary Professor Mary O'Kane AC, and I'll have more to say about Mary a little later. My great mate and buddy on the front bench, Brendan O'Connor, the Minister for Skills. The Assistant Minister for Education, Anthony Chisholm, who's just had to bail and go off to the Senate to vote for the tax cuts, so please thank Anthony as well. The Shadow Minister for Education, Senator Sarah Henderson, who hopefully is in there as well voting for the tax cuts. The Shadow Assistant Minister for Education, my friend Nola Marino, who's here as well. All of the many, many members of Parliament who join us tonight. Can I also offer a very, very special welcome to Baroness Valerie Amos from Oxford University. Baroness, it's so wonderful to have you here, and welcome to Australia. Can I also recognise the Chancellors, the Vice-Chancellors, Commissioners, Chief Executive Officers and all of the higher education leaders that are here with us tonight. Last year, Australia voted no to constitutional change, but we didn't vote no to improving the lives of Indigenous Australians. The shocking truth is that Indigenous Australians are more likely to die young, to get a chronic disease, and to miss out on an education than the rest of us. That's real, and that hasn't changed. And there is no more shocking example of that than the fact that an Indigenous boy today is more likely to go to jail than one of our universities. None of us want that to be true, but it is. And so as I stand here and recognise the traditional owners of the land on which we meet tonight, I also recognise that there is still a mountain of work to do, that education can be and should be the great equaliser in an unequal world, the most powerful cause for good, and that we all must acknowledge the failures of the past and the gaps that still exist, and that in our collective hands is the power to change that, in education perhaps more than anywhere else. The first time I spoke at this dinner, I told you a little about me and what drives me. I spoke about the power of education to change lives, how it changed the lives of the kids I went to school with, and how it changed mine. I told you how I was the first person in my family to finish Year 10. After I finished Year 10, I got a part-time job collecting shopping trolleys in the car park at Fairfield Woolies. That car park isn't there anymore. Today it's the site of Western Sydney University's new Fairfield Connect, a university study hub, and it opened on the weekend. And that's where I released the Universities Accord final report. I still remember that 15-year-old kid in the car park shoving shopping trolleys together, trying not to crash them into parked cars. In that summer of '87, this building still hadn't opened. The Berlin Wall still hadn't fallen. TikTok was just what clocks did. There were still only 3 Star Wars movies. And perhaps it should have stayed that way. And one of the greatest albums of all time had just come out. Of course, I mean Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction. It's always the ones at the back, isn't it? Back then, the percentage of people in Fairfield with a university degree was about a third of what it was across the rest of the country. And not much has changed. Today, the percentage of people in Fairfield with a uni degree is about half the national average. And that, at its core, is what the Universities Accord is all about changing that. And that's why I released it there. The fundamental point that the Accord makes is that while demand for university places is pretty flat at the moment and will be over the next few years, it won't stay that way forever. Over the next quarter of a century, the fact is that we're going to need more teachers, more nurses, more engineers, more IT workers than we have today. The fastest growing parts of the economy will be in jobs that require a university degree. Think about this. 1 in 2 jobs created today requires a uni degree. 90% require a uni degree or a vet qualification. That means that if we want this country to be everything that we think it can be, if we want it to be stronger and better and fairer than it is today, if we want to help small businesses to expand and new ideas to take root, if we want a future made in Australia, then we have to make those skills here in Australia. Under Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, the percentage of young people who finish school jumped from about 40% to almost 80%. That's a lot of us here sitting in this room tonight. That changed us as a country. Nation-changing stuff. The Universities Accord says that in the world that lies ahead, we're going to need a workforce where it's not just 80% of people who have finished school that are in that workforce, but 80% of them have got a TAFE qualification or a university degree. And that's no easy task. If we're going to do this, the Accord says that we've got to break down 2 barriers. One of those barriers is invisible, and the other one is artificial. Both of them are fundamental to building the skills that we're going to need. The artificial barrier is the one that we've built ourselves between vocational education and higher education. And what the report says is that we're not going to fix the skill shortages that we have right now and that we're going to have in the future unless the 2 systems are more integrated, unless they work more closely together, unless we fix things like recognition of prior learning and the Australian qualifications framework, making it easier, for example, for what you've learned at TAFE to be counted towards a degree at university, so you can get a degree quicker and cheaper. Now, there are already things that are happening to help break down this artificial barrier. A great example is the National Skills Agreement that my good friend Brendan O'Connor struck last year with the Commonwealth and the states, investing about $650 million to establish up to 20 centres of excellence, places where TAFE and unis come together, where you can get a certificate or a diploma or a degree. But what this report says is if we really want to get the 2 sectors working more closely together, we need one target and one body that can help to better integrate the 2 and what they do. What it calls an Australian Tertiary Education Commission. And to help more people to reskill and upskill quickly, particularly where we've got skills shortages, it recommends some major changes to how we fund, accredit and recognise micro-credentials. The second barrier, that invisible barrier, is the one that explains why 69% of young people from wealthy families have a university degree today, and only 19% from very poor families do. Now let that sink in for a minute. 69% of young people from wealthy families have a university degree today, only 19% from very poor families. And this is not just a barrier to university, it's a barrier to any type of tertiary qualification. This report peels away any misconception that it's okay if kids from poor families, if kids from the outer suburbs, if kids from the bush don't go to uni, because, hey, they all go to TAFE. This is what this report shows. 87% of young people from wealthy families have a TAFE qualification or a university qualification, 87%. But only 59% of young people from poor families do. In other words, more than 40% of people from poor families today don't have the sort of qualifications that almost everybody is going to need tomorrow, in the years ahead. In a world like that, closing that gap is more important than it has ever been. And that brings me back to Fairfield. A lot of those young people live in places like that. What the Accord says is if we're going to build the skills we need, we're going to need to get at least 80% of the workforce with a tertiary qualification. That change has to happen there, in places like that. That means the sort of reform that breaks down the barriers that stop more young people from places like Fairfield getting the chance to go to university and succeed when they get there. And not just them, kids from regional Australia too, and the most remote parts of our country. Bringing university closer to them is part of that. I know that. A lot of people that I grew up with just felt like university was too far away, that it was for someone else, somewhere else. That's why study hubs like the one in Fairfield are so important. And that's why over the next 12 to 18 months we'll set up 34 university hubs in the regions and in the outer suburbs. It's part of breaking down that invisible barrier. But that's just the start. The Accord recommends a new dedicated outreach program and better careers advice in and outside of school. The expansion of fee-free university prep courses to help more people to get the foundational skills that they need to go to university. A guaranteed place at university for all students who come from poor backgrounds and from the regions who qualify for the course that they want to do, just like we did last year for Indigenous students. And a new needs-based funding system that gives students from poor backgrounds and students who study in the regions and the bush the extra academic and support services that they need when they get to university to help them succeed, to help them to complete their degree, and bonuses for universities that hit agreed completion targets. There's also a bunch of recommendations to help tackle some of the financial barriers that can stop students from studying. Things like the cost of mandatory unpaid work placements. It recommends payments to teaching and caring and nursing students while they do their prac, tackling the burden of placement poverty, which so many students go through. It also recommends changes to help, to make it fairer and simpler, and moving towards a student contribution system based on potential lifetime earnings, and a new jobs broker to help students find part-time work while they're at university in areas relevant to their study. Not that there's anything wrong with collecting trolleys at Woolies or cooking cheese toast at Sizzler. But none of this is going to work on its own. Before we have any chance of getting more young people from poor families and from the regions into university, we need more to finish school. And in the last 6 years, that has gone backwards. Not everywhere. It's dropping in our public schools. It's dropped from 83% to 76% over the last 6 years. And it's dropping amongst poor kids. In 2017, 76% of students from poor families completed high school. 76%. Now it's 70%. If we want to turn that around, we need to do a better job of helping young people who fall behind at school to catch up, because they're the ones who aren't finishing school. And at the moment, if you're a child from a poor family or from the regions, you're 3 times more likely to be that child who falls behind. Most of those children who fall behind when they're little never catch up, but they could. And part of fixing that is funding our schools properly and tying that funding to the things that we know work. That's why the next National School Reform Agreement that I'm working on right now is so important. But even before that, we need to help children who start behind at school to get a better start. The children who are least likely at the moment to go to early education, and the ones that we know are most likely to benefit from it. In other words, we need a better and a fairer education system across the board. The Accord is just one part of that. And over the coming months, the government will work through it in detail and determine what needs to be done first. There's a lot in it, Mary. It's a blueprint not for just one budget, but for the next few decades. And as I've said a number of times, we can't do everything at once. We've got to stage it. This is a long-term plan, but we've got to start now. And that means prioritising what we think is most important. Just on that issue of prioritising what's most important. That first speech that I made at this dinner, I didn't just talk about my story. I talked about the 1 in 6 university students who've been sexually harassed and the 1 in 20 who've been sexually assaulted. I talked about how we need to make sure that everyone who works or studies or lives in our universities are safe and feel safe, and the onus on all of us to make that happen. A lot has happened since then. On Friday, I announced that we would establish an independent national student ombudsman to investigate and resolve disputes and give students a stronger voice when the worst happens. I'll introduce legislation to make this a reality, and it will start its work next year. In that first speech, I also talked about the politics and the political interference that has bedevilled the Australian Research Council, and I promised to fix that too, and I am. Legislation to do that is in the Senate right now and will hopefully be voted on soon and become law. It's a chance to get the politics and the politicians out of the ARC. The Universities Accord zeroes in on research too, and it makes a number of recommendations to build on our world-class research capability. And it also makes a number of recommendations to improve teaching in our universities, including professional learning and teaching standards and minimum teaching qualifications. There are not many things that it doesn't touch. And I want to take this opportunity in front of you, the people who will play an indispensable part in its implementation, to pay a special thanks to the incomparable Professor Mary O'Kane AC. Those of us who are privileged enough to know Mary know that she is above politics, that she is above reproach, and above all, that she is an extraordinary human being. And if this is the blueprint for higher education for the next few decades, then Mary O'Kane is the architect. Thank you, Mary, from the bottom of my heart. I also want to thank the members of the Accord panel, Jenny Macklin, Shamara Wickramanayaka, Barney Glover, Larissa Barent, Fiona Nash and Ben Rimmer. And I also want to thank, they deserve a clap as well. And I also want to thank everyone here. Everyone who wrote a submission, attended a meeting, wrote an op-ed or even a tweet. I asked for your ideas and I am so grateful for them. I've told you before, I want to be a harvester of good ideas. And I hope you can see now that I meant it. None of us are here forever. Not even Vice-Chancellors. But we have a chance in the next few years to start work on something that will outlast us. To plant seeds in a garden we don't get to see. The O'Kane reforms. Remember that 80% target in the Accord? A workforce where 80% have a tertiary qualification? If that's right, the percentage of young people in that workforce with a tertiary qualification will be even higher than that, more likely 90% or more. They're the kids in primary school today. Kids like my little guy in second class, or his little brother still in nappies. They're the babies that will be born tomorrow and the day after that, into poverty and into wealth and everything in between. And they'll grow up in big cities and the outer suburbs, in the regions and the bush. They'll go to school in the 30s and they'll go to TAFE or to university in the 40s. And we have to be ready for them. The country that they will inherit is counting on us. They are counting on us. And that, more than anything else, is what the Universities Accord is all about. Thank you very much.